I don't have it on my side.
Hello, everybody. We are letting folks come in from the waiting room, so give us just a minute. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Susanna Hermans. I'm co-owner of Oblong Books in New York's Hudson Valley. Yes, hello. I would love it if you could each drop into the chat where you're joining us from tonight so we can see everybody. Tonight, I'm so excited to be here with two of my, no joke, favorite people, Kelly Braffet and Owen King. Kelly, I was just thinking about how your event with us for the Unwilling hardcover was in February 2020, and it was one of our last in-person events before the pandemic.
Yeah, that whole book just sneaked in under the wire. I think I lost 2 events, but and I could have gone to one of them, but it was just, everything was starting to feel weird.
Yes, we had you in conversation with Erin Morgenstern at a big, beautiful, like converted church. It was a stunning night. And a really fun, one of the only fond memories I have of the year 2020. So thank you for that.
I'm glad I could be of assistance.
Yes, so to give you a proper introduction for those joining us tonight, Kelly is the author of The Unwilling, Save Yourself, Josie and Jack, and Last Seen Leaving. Her writing has been published in the New York Times and Vulture.com, as well as the Fairy Tale Review, Post Road, and several anthologies. She's joined tonight by your husband, Owen King, another of our favorites. Owen is the author of the novel Double Feature and We're All in This Together, a Novella and Stories. He's the co-author of Intro to Alien Invasion and the co-editor of Who Can Save Us Now? Brand New Superheroes and Their Amazing Short Stories. They are here tonight to talk about Kelly's new book, a follow-up to The Unwilling, The Broken Tower, and they're joining us from their home in the Hudson Valley. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Susanna. This is so great. This is a real test of my attention span, because the little things at the bottom, I just want to look at them. This is like when I watch TV, Kelly, and I have to look at my phone every 5 seconds to make sure I didn't miss anything important in the world.
Yeah, it's distracting. There's like people I know, and I want to say,
Yeah,
how are you? And
Hey,
it's
everybody.
not appropriate. Not the venue. We'll have all those conversations later, everyone.
Yes, I'm going to spirit myself away, and I'll be back later on for the Q&A. In the meantime, I'm going to drop some links into the chat to buy signed copies of Kelly's books, as well as audiobooks. We love audiobooks. And I'll also say, please think of questions to ask our guests throughout the evening. Drop them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those toward the end of the event. You guys good?
Yeah,
we're good.
All right, I'll be back. Have fun.
Okay.
Can I just say this? It's so wonderful to do one of these events with a guaranteed friendly interviewer.
Yeah, right.
I know you're not going to try and gotcha me, because I'll make you pay later.
If it wasn't for the little chat thing at the bottom, I would feel like we were just having a midday chat, kind of. Doesn't it feel that way a little bit? This is eerie. We're more dressed up than usual.
We kind of, yeah, I'm very rarely this made up at any time of the day or night. But yeah, normally we would be discussing grocery lists and
what should we get for dinner?
Where's the takeout going to come from tonight? But we do communicate like this a lot, because Owen's office is over our garage, so it's separate from the house. So we can't just sort of shout to each other during the day, which is by design, but means that we spend a lot of time.
It is a little, it does seem like I should be saying, have you seen my glasses? You know? Well, Kelly, this is very exciting. You just published your 5th novel.
Crazy.
Amazing. And actually, I just thought of a question even before my little list here. What does that feel like? You know, five books in, you've been doing this. When did you publish the first book? Was it 2005?
Josie and Jack? I think so, because I think I sold it in 2003. And then the lag time, I think it came out February 2005. So yeah, almost inching up on 20 years.
Could you have imagined that?
Depends on the day. I mean, grab me on a good day. And of course, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to be the world's, most famous writer and publish a book every 6 months. Grab me on a bad day. And I'm like, no, I'm going to be working at Walmart for the rest of my life, obviously. It's very strange. And if those of you who follow me on Instagram will be able to go back and look, and Owen actually took a picture of all of my books from our brag shelf lined up next to each other. And I hadn't seen them that way. And I hadn't thought about it that way before. And it was a little bit mind-blowing because I did not grow up in a world where people were writers. It's not a thing that I grew up in the world where I said I wanted to be a writer. And then people said, oh, that's sweet. Now, how are you going to make money? What are you really going to do for a living? Which was a fair question. But, of course, being me, I said, well, I'm going to be a writer. But it's still it was a little strange to see them all like lined up, and they're pretty different. This book, this series in particular, I don't think I ever thought until, the last, when did Unwilling came out in 2020. So I don't think I thought until 2019 or so that this series would ever see the light of day, that it would ever leave my head. So that in particular is a little bit, I still sort of find myself looking at these books and going, really? Cool.
Well, let's talk about the Unwilling and the Broken Tower. I was very excited to do this, but what was a little challenging was that you've written these are the two books together. And I was trying to think about how we could talk about this, because I assume some people in the audience haven't read the first book, but are interested. And I was trying to figure out how to talk about the new book. And I think we have to talk about the first book just a little bit, if we could circle back.
Sure.
And I'm just going to read this because it is a little bit a little bit, there's some stuff happening. So without giving everything away in the first book, it introduces us to the royal brothers, Gavin and Theron, Gavin's betrothed, Ellie, and Judah the foundling. And they're 4 young adults who live together inside the vast castle of Highfall, which is so enormous, so capacious and strange that parts of it have been forgotten, parts of it are falling down, and it's like its own character, in fact. And there are a whole bunch of interesting supporting characters, but those are the core 4 characters. And the central, it seems to me anyway, and you can say if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right based on things you've said to me before, the central knot of the story is that Judah and Gavin are mystically intertwined, such that when something happens to one of them, the other person feels it. So
something physical.
Right,
like
something
physical
physical.
sensation.
So if Judah were to be killed, the heir to the throne would die because they are entwined. Right. And this is strange occurrence because, and on top of everything else, Judah is not actually related to Gavin. She's an orphan. This complication is the motivating event for everything that happens in both books. It's what starts everything, basically, in some sense. And what I wanted to ask you was, I love that premise. It's so fun. It's so cool that these two unrelated people are tightly knotted together in this way. And what I wanted to ask you was, where did that idea come from, and what about it engaged your imagination and made you want to write these two huge and amazing books about it?
Well, if anyone was around for The Unwilling, if anyone has read The Unwilling and was around for any of my promotion thereof before it all got so rudely cut short by the pandemic, I started thinking about this book when I was in college. And the way I started thinking about it was that I read a fantasy novel by a writer that I knew that I liked, whose other work I had read, but this was the first fantasy novel of theirs that I'd read. And I was very excited for it. And I was, I think, a senior in college, and I didn't do a lot of reading for fun. So this was like I'm going to read this book, damn it, and it's going to be fun. And I didn't like it, which sucked. And I'm going to take the name of that novel to my grave, so don't ask. But I thought to myself, well, I could do better than that. And I lay awake that night because I didn't sleep at that point in my life anyway, thinking about a fantasy novel. And the germ for the idea was actually these four people sort of rattling around this huge, empty, sort of broken down house, sort of after the end of everything, which ended up being the second half of The Unwilling. There's the civilization sort of breaks down halfway through The Unwilling, or at least the civilization that they know does. And they're sort of stuck in this house, and it's literally just the four of them. So that was the first idea. And I am generally sort of not a huge fan of metaphors that compare writing to magic, because I think it sort of elides a lot of the work and thought and planning that goes into it. But every now and then there is a character that sort of steps up and says, hey, what's up? Here I am. And that's what these four people did. The relationships were always there. It was always the four of them. It was always Gavin and his brother and his betrothed, and then Judah, who was this sort of other, who was from somewhere else, but still somehow a part of this weird little group. And so then the question became, why in the world would they keep her alive in this world where people are not particularly kind or empathetic? Like, I know there's lots of historical precedent for, like, the heir to the throne playing with the gardener's boy, or, whatever, that has happened a lot, but these people would not allow that, particularly not for somebody of the opposite gender, because that could lead to all sorts of nastiness. So that's where the idea came from. And like I said, I've had 20 years to poke around at this story and to sort of look for the holes and try to fill them up the way I could. But once that sort of central idea was there, you're right, everything else spun off from there, because, it makes her so crucially important. And that's the only importance that she has in this world. And that sort of tension between the importance she feels for herself as a human being and a woman, and somebody who is becoming an adult and a smart person, versus the fact that the rest of the world around her just sort of thinks that she needs to survive. Like, right. They could have locked her in a cell and kept her fed and warm, and she could have gone quietly insane, and that would have worked too. But
the person who's a complete outsider is the inside has to let her in, right?
It has to. Yeah, there's no way around it. And they've tried everything they could to sort of break this bond between them, because it's absolutely, it makes everything extremely difficult. But yeah, it's unbreakable, because it's not a world. The other weird, strange thing about this as a fantasy novel is it's not a world that's full of magic. It's not there is obviously magic in it, and there's magic. There are other parts of this universe that have magic, but the people in Highfall don't have magic. They speak very sort of scornfully of people who believe in witchcraft and spells and that sort of thing. So it really is out of left field for them.
Right. Well, one more thing before we get into the specifics of the Broken Tower. Before The Unwilling, you published 3 novels that were all contemporary set and would have tended to get filed in the mystery section. What attracts you to the fantasy genre? And I know you've written another book that's sort of a little bit more. You've already written another book that's a little more like the ones you've written previously. But what is it about fantasy that attracted you, and that what is it that you can do in there that you couldn't do in the other books, or is it just another kind of story to you?
Well, fantasy is what I started out reading. you know, so the crime stuff all came much, much later in my life, and actual like capital L literature came much, much later in my life. My younger years were all pretty fantasy heavy. So it's obviously something, I mean, you know me, I'm escapist as I'll get out. You know, how many hours today did I spend playing Skyrim? Like, if I can be in another world, I want to be in another world. No offense to this one. But I think that it's sort of like the same, it's sort of an extension of the same reason that I don't like to write about real places. Like my first novel was set partially in New York City, which is the only time I've ever done that. Most of the time they're in an entirely made up town. And it's because I don't want somebody standing there going, you know, Vine Street doesn't hit 3rd Avenue there. Like, you know, that store didn't open until 1982, and this book takes place in 1978, and that sort of thing. And in fantasy, it's the same way, except it's like more so. You know, I can make anything I want happen if I can justify it within the rules of the world. And that's really fun. It can be really tedious when you have to like sit down and do the math and figure out how long, do the research and then the math and figure out how long it would take like a carriage to get from point A to point B. And you know, when I wrote that new book that you're talking about, it was so wonderful to just have them be able to get in cars and go places. Like I didn't have to explain how they got there. I didn't have to explain the mechanics of it. Like they just picked up their phone and they called someone, and it was just so easy. The book's like half the length of any of these, and I think it's just a lot of that is me not having to say, so this is what the street looked like. Because nobody's seen a street in High Fall before. Everybody's seen a street in Middle America.
Right. All right. So let's talk about the Broken Tower. I don't want to give away everything that happened at the end of the Unwilling.
There was a nasty cliffhanger.
There was a big cliffhanger. I don't want to give it all away. But I'll say that the Broken Tower finds the central characters, Gavin, Ellie, and Judah, spreading out in all directions from the castle at High Fall. Gavin and Ellie find themselves in an inhospitable situation in the kingdom of Tiernan, which is where Ellie is from, and which is just has a very different culture, I would say, than High Fall. And Judah finds herself thrown into the company of 2 mysterious travelers, Lukash and Cleric. Meanwhile, a new character comes to prominence, Corsa, who I want to ask you about in a little later on if we have time, who is the chieftain of a defeated army, and he has been tasked on penalty of death by the seneschal, who is a political mover and shaker in High Fall, with creating a psychic bond, very much like the one between Gavin and Judah, between a group of orphan children. Now, this probably sounds super overwhelming. I haven't read the first book, but what I most loved about this sequel was the way that you sent all these little shoots off in different directions, but you never went away so long that I got disengaged or forgot. You just had the rhythm of these, I would say, 4 storylines really well down. And it's just a pleasure to read and see how the threads come together in the end. And they really do come together in the end in a way that is different than the first book. I wouldn't say that the second book, there's a lot that we wonder about at the end of the second book. But I wouldn't say it's a cliffhanger exactly.
No, it's not the same.
But so what I wanted to ask you was, how did you keep all these balls up in the air? Was this always part of the plan? And what are the challenges of writing a book like that?
Well, I had the idea. I mean, it's the bit of the story with Judah and Lukash and Cleric, like that was actually part of my original conception for the book. That moment where she like finds them in the woods. Those sort of moments when she comes back to herself. And in fact, you know, I've tried to write this book probably 50 times over the years. And that's often been somewhere that I've started and tried to sort of go back and tell all the stuff that happened in Highfall and flashback. And it never worked. And that's because there was too much in Highfall. As far as, so I knew where all of these characters went after
the end of the book.
The Unwilling. Thank you. Watch as I try to remember the name of the book that I wrote 2 years ago. But what I ended up doing when I was actually writing it, mechanically speaking, is I was jumping back and forth a little while. And then finally, I think I was in the middle of the Tiernan section. And I was just like, I just have to write this. I just have to write it and get it done. And so that's what I ended up doing, was writing each of the 4 storylines start to finish, without breaking them up, just getting it all out. And in fact, I don't even think I did chapter headings. You might well remember this. There's these moments when I had this enormous stack of paper, because again, the book is, 600 or 700 pages in manuscript. I had it all spread out on our kitchen table, trying to figure out like where to break it and what needed to go before what. And it became a very sort of physical, mechanical puzzle. And I'd never done that before. I've written lots of books where I've jumped back and forth between characters, but it's always seemed obvious to me where the story should go next time. And this time around, I think perhaps because for the first time, each story had sort of its own. The stories that I've told previously have jumped in and out of other characters' heads, but this one, each storyline had its own arc, had its own beginning, middle, and end. How do Gavin and Ellie get out of this situation? What happens with Corson? And so it became very important to sort of get those stories right before I figured out how they all went together. And I did know that they all went together. So there was, I knew that there was a way to fit them, and I knew where the sort of gears had to catch with each other. But it was chaos until the last draft. It was a big mess physically, and I think there's still like a stack of manuscript paper up in my office with like Post-its for each chapter with little notes saying this is what happens here, because I was literally cutting the pages in half and sticking them together.
Right. Do you have a favorite storyline? I mean, one of the things I really liked about the book is that I never felt like you were spinning wheels to give a character airtime.
Yeah.
So that it felt equal, because it feels very equal between the 4 storylines that are in this book.
Do I have a favorite? Normally that question is really easy to answer. This time I think it's harder. I don't know if I do, because I love Lucas and Cleric. Like, they were so much fun to write. They're these two sort of, as Lucas says at one point, he says, we're thieves, we're not murderers. But they met cheating at cards, and it's so they're these two completely scrappy guys who are from completely different places that I had not had a chance to write about before. So they were super fun. Corso was sort of a surprise, because he was a character that it didn't occur to me until after I was done with The Unwilling that I could use him to tell more of the story. He's very satisfying too. I really loved that Ellie got to do some stuff. Like, most of her sections most of the storyline in Tiernan is from her point of view. And that was really fun, because the original draft of The Unwilling had a big chunk of Ellie's point of view in it, and it ended up getting cut because that book was 1,000,000 years long, and we had to cut something because physically they couldn't bind it as big as it was. I think probably my favorite is Bindi, and Bindi is a character. She's a street kid who in The Unwilling gets a job working for sort of a doctor character who's one of the few people who goes back and forth through the wall between the palace and the city. And I wanted her in the story in The Unwilling because I wanted so many fantasy novels focus on ruling class and the royalty. And I wanted to show the life of just an average poor person in not the very poorest, but almost the very poorest section of the city. And I loved her when I was writing her. and she gets to tell a huge chunk of this story. And I think she probably edges out just a little bit because her perspective is so interesting. She's probably 13 or 14. She's very young. She doesn't know, she's very wise, sort of streetwise, but she hasn't seen a lot of the world. And yeah, she's very she's scrappy. She tries.
Two things. One, I think a cat just broke into your room.
Yes, a cat just came in.
And two, something slightly creepy about the way the door just went behind you, but I can't see. That. But I was going to say about Bindi, I think it's funny. Bindi does play a huge role in the book, but for whatever reason, I think of Corsa as owning that storyline because they're both in the same place. Relatively speaking, they're both in Highfall,
They are, but they're in completely different.
I don't even know if they meet. I can't remember if they do. Maybe they meet once.
She meets him very briefly right before he gets out of prison.
Right. Well, you answered my Corsa question, but I'm maybe there's one more thing about it. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you about Judah. She is the main character, yes. I think, I would say. In the first book, she's incredibly strong. She's defiant. And I think that in the new book, she still has that strength and defiance. I mean, sometimes her defiance gets to a point where it's almost perverse, that's just who she is, Yeah. She can't make anything easy. And, but in the new book, I feel like she still possesses some of those qualities, but she has, without giving it away, at the end of the first book, she suffers a pretty terrible betrayal and a pretty terrible loss, and she's changed. How do you see her arc developing?
Well, in the first book, I mean, that was her, even though she was not a part of the world, that was her world. Like, she knew what the rules were, whether she chose to follow them or not. And so in a way, it was sort of easier for her to kick against those rules because it was all so very familiar to her. The betrayal comes from a completely unexpected quarter, and I think that shakes her. I think she never expected that to happen. I'm sorry, you'll all just have to read. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll all just have to read the first book. It's very frustrating. I'm sorry. In this next book, she is much less sure of herself because she's in a completely different place, she's absolutely does not have the ground under her. And the things that she thought she knew, even about her own power, don't seem to be true anymore. And so she's playing her cards very close because she just doesn't know enough about the situation. But at the same time, she doesn't know enough about the world. She doesn't know if she's safe or not. Spoiler, she's not, ever. But I think that basically, I mean, obviously the power is, as it usually is, a metaphor. Like, all of my books are about power. And so this book, in the first book, she ends up having she and Gavin have this special power, and then she discovers new layers to it. And in the second book, she once again discovers new layers to the power that she thought she had. And it's all about her sort of finding her feet and figuring out where she comes from and what that means to her. And I feel like this is what all of my books are about. I feel like every book I've ever written is about somebody sort of trying to come to terms with what the world expects of them, what they have previously expected of themselves. Like, is that actually what they want from the world? Trying to find a way to sort of chart their own course without, while sort of tempering and navigating the disappointment that might come from other people or the expectations that might come from other people. And except this time I get to do it with magic,
right.
which is fun.
Let's jump back to Corsa real quick.
Yeah.
I was so interested in what you just said because I have here that I'd written down. He only has a cameo in The Unwilling. I was very surprised in a good way by his importance in this new book. And what I wanted to ask was, did you know when he appeared in the first book that he was going to come back in the second? And it sounds like you didn't know. And I also wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about what a different world he comes from.
Yeah. Well, the city of Highfall is very sort of, think like Versailles or something like that. You know, it's got all of these courtiers and they're all very wealthy and over the top, and it's all about how you look, and there's all these sort of shades of meaning and subtlety. And then, of course, that civilization sort of falls partway through The Unwilling and things get very gritty. And then in comes Corsa, and he's taken prisoner, and he's literally dragged in. He's taken prisoner in a altercation that happens off screen, and he's literally brought into the city in a cage. And all of Judah is watching him come in, and he's got, you know, tattoos up and down his arms, and he's got earrings, and he's got this, like, she notices that he's got this green eyeliner that she'd never seen before. And she thinks to herself, man, if the courtiers could see that, they'd be all over it. And even just that little glimpse of this totally different world, it was sort of like a breath of fresh air, seems like the wrong thing to say, but he caught my interest. And so when I was putting together the story for the second book, I needed something to happen. And he was there, like he was in prison waiting to be used. And he comes from a much better place. Like, honestly, given the choice, that is where I would go. I would go visit the Nolly. I would not hang out in the Highfall, because they're very, like, one of the things that it's sort of, we don't know what their technological level is. I have no reason to think that it's any lower than anybody else's, but they all have this sort of sense of, he calls it kagir, this sort of thing that's almost like what Judah and Gavin have, except instead of being based in pain and destruction, it's based in like knowing the other person fully. And they form these, you know, the Seneschal inappropriately calls them fighting units. That's not what they are. They're more like chosen family. And one of the things that horrifies him about Highfall, that just baffles him, is, you know, he ends up with all these orphans, and he's like, well, what's an orphan? And the Seneschal says, well, an orphan is somebody, you know, kid that doesn't have anybody to take care of them. He's like, but how is that possible? Like, how could that even happen? If you know that there's a child that needs to be taken care of, how could you not take care of the child? Like, he is, in a lot of ways, he's the only character that has like a fully formed sense of empathy and of like consideration and care for the world. And he ends up in this very bleak place, being, you know, in charge of this, being charged with the care of this sort of motley group of orphans that he doesn't want to love, but he kind of starts to love them. And he doesn't want anything bad to happen to them, but he knows he doesn't really have control over that. So he was sort of fun to write, but it was also, he's trapped in the house the whole time. He's trapped in the castle, and that made him sort of physically more difficult to write, because his perspective is a little bit claustrophobic. You know what I mean? Because he doesn't get to go anywhere or really talk to anybody except these kids, and occasionally the Seneschal, who never says anything he wants to hear.
Right. So one more question before we open it up, if that's all right.
Sure.
The Unwilling and The Broken Tower are both fantasy novels. There's with magic in them.
Yep.
Which would seem to be really dramatically different from your previous three books, which are entirely without magic, to say the least. You know, they're pretty down. At the same time, though, it's not as if the viewpoint is still very clearly yours. There's a grit to everything in in these two books, and you never lose track of the servants and the stable keepers and Bindi in the city, and even the seneschal who's kind of in a down and dirty world himself as an operator, you know. And there is this realism to the book. I mean, I even think of in the first book, Bindi has a baby that is suffering from air pollution because it hangs around a paper factory all day long, right?
He's got rickets. He doesn't have enough vitamin D.
Right, and the baby's sick. And I mean, just that.
It's her brother, because we were talking about, Bindi being young.
But just you know, the idea of rickets inside a fantasy novel doesn't make an immediate connection for me. It seems really real, really real.
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to ask you was, why was it so important to you to treat life in this quasi-medieval world with so much realism?
Because I wanted it to feel like a real world. And that was something I actually spent a lot of time on. One of the things that happens in the Unwilling when the civilization falls is that there are shortages. And one of the things that they can no longer get is coffee. And I actually sat down and thought, well, where does the coffee come from? If they're drinking coffee, it's got to come from somewhere. They live in this sort of Northern England, cold, wet place. They're not growing coffee. There's this wonderful book. This is going to seem like a non sequitur, but I swear it's not, which you're going to have to buy used because I don't think it's still in print, but it's Diana Wynne Jones's The Tough Guide to Fantasyland. Super hilarious. I mean, it's a satire, but it says things like, you know, fantasy. It's written in sort of a encyclopedic tone, and the entry on horses is like, fantasy horses are awesome. They never need to eat. They never need to get water. They never get tired. They never need to be rubbed down. They never get saddled. They never get blisters under their saddles. They're amazing. Why wouldn't you want one? And it's sort of that I'm trying to combat, rather than just sort of put the trappings on of the, you know, medieval fantasy world, medieval-esque. It's sort of actually early modernish, but
it's kind of a mix of things.
There's a little bit of Victorian in there.
Different technologies. There's electricity, sort of.
I mean, there's gas lights and things, but I really wanted it to feel like these people were living in a real place. They really have sewage problems. You know, somebody really has to scrub the toilets. I remember every time there's a scene in and we've been rewatching Lost. Owen and I have, as a family. And every time they're walking through the jungle, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, God, there are so many bugs. There are so many bugs in that jungle, and there are so many mosquitoes. And where are the mosquitoes? There's a cat. Hi, Barney. And that was a thing that I kept, that has always bothered me about these sort of, you know, lovely visions of this medieval world where people are going through, you know, forests wearing these long, you know, gauzy gowns. That's not going to work. Have you ever walked through a forest that? There's that. Remember that movie with Kate Beckinsale where she was the vampire hunter? Was it Kate Beckinsale?
I think she was a vampire hunter. Yeah, and I'm not sure I've seen the movie, but I'm certain she was a vampire hunter in one. She
had 4-inch heels that she was fighting vampires in the woods, right. And I was like, the woman's got 2 broken ankles. There's a realism that is. I understand that fantasy is about escape, and I understand that people don't necessarily want to think about the bugs and the broken ankles and the sore feet and the shoes that don't work. I do. I want to think about what it's like to live in that world. Where does it go?
And that's part of it, even though there's magic, is the hard stuff. The hard stuff. And a lot of the, you know, the conceit of the first book is that the magic was once there and is now gone. And one of the things that the magic is sort of reputed to have done is to make everybody's life a little bit easier in small ways. For instance, turning on a faucet and getting reliable water, having a dishwasher,
those sort of things.
Well, thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Owen.
Thank you for joining me. I was hoping we could open the floor up to questions, Susanna.
Yes. Oh my gosh, this has been such a great discussion. So
I see Albert says these are good questions. Albert, the check will be coming tomorrow.
He's a plant. I love it. Also, I just have to say, looking at the list of folks who are on with us tonight, it's so many friends and folks who
so nice of you all.
Had we been in person, would have come to our store. So it's really beautiful to see
awesome.
you guys. Yeah, let's do a little Q&A. So folks who are joining us, please give us some questions in the Q&A. We have one from Jennifer. She's wondering, did you set out to write a series as opposed to a standalone book, or did the story force the longer format as you started writing?
Well, I sort of thought that it would be a standalone. What turned out to be The Unwilling, I thought was going to be like the first 3 chapters of the book, and then we were going to jump to Lucas and Clara and Judah, and that turned out not to be the case. It sort of took over. And then, I mean, I've never written anything this long in my life, and were it not fantasy, I do not think I would have been able to get away with it, because publishers have very strong feelings about books that you can, defend yourself in an alley with. They don't tend to enjoy them. They prefer them be nice and slim and easy and cheap to print.
What made it so that you could, what was sort of you've been thinking about the book for so long. Why was there a moment where you're like, oh, I can write it now?
You know what? That's actually sort of a strange, sad story. So Maggie Estep. Does everybody know Maggie Estep? She was a spoken word artist, and she wrote a novel called Hex, actually, which I read not too long ago, which is really fun. It's a mystery. She was somebody she did this great song. Look it up, super fun. Back when MTV did not just music, but slam poetry. And she was on their site a lot, or she was on their site. Look at me. She was on MTV's Poetry Slam a lot. And she did this great song called Hey Baby, which was about street harassment. And I heard it in college, and it was like, I was a pretty sheltered kid. And so it was like this light going on over my head, like, this little like baby feminist in me went, oh, hello. Anyhow, so she was great. And she was somebody that I sort of kept an eye on for all these years. And eventually, as lots of artists do, she moved to the Hudson Valley. Again, hello. And this is the sad part. She very suddenly died. Like she woke up and walked her dog and came home and said to her boyfriend, I don't feel very good, and went to the ER and was dead, was gone within hours. And I remember, she's not that much older than me. And I remember thinking to myself, God, I've been thinking about this book for 20 years. And if I wake up tomorrow, and we don't have a dog, but if I wake up tomorrow and suddenly die, then this whole story is gone. This whole world is gone, and all of these people are gone. And at the same time, I was trying to work on a book that wasn't working very well. And I needed something else to write. So I actually went to see my agent, Julie, who I think is in this office. And I think she's in the chat. And she was just like, well, why don't you write the fantasy novel? You've been talking about it for years. You've never shown me anything. I don't think you've ever finished a manuscript. Make that what you do. And then if nothing else, you'll have it done and you'll get it out of your system. And so that's what we did. There she is saying, hi, hello. Julie's here.
So speaking of Julie has posed a question. She asks, what would you tell your younger self about writing and publishing if you could go back in time when you were just starting out?
Oh, God. I wish that there was somebody else here that I could get to answer that question so I could think about it for a minute.
These give me questions for both of you. Owen, nice try. Getting out of questions.
Do you have thoughts?
About what we've learned about, what would you say?
What would we tell our younger selves about publishing? I think one thing that surprised me was that you're never done. You know, like when I was in grad school, the big thing was, God, if I could only get an agent. And then I got an agent. It was like, God, if I could only sell a book. And then I sold a book. And now it's like, but if I could only get a bestseller, you know, and so there's always, and then I know people who have gotten bestsellers and who are like, you know, be nice to win a prize, you know, like there's always another level of the ladder. And so it sort of doesn't, I'd like to think that I managed to do this anyway, but I would like to tell my younger self to think less about those things and think more about just focusing on the work. Just make,
Yeah.
I had a professor in grad school who was like, good writing will always find a home. And I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a good thing to sort of cling to.
No, and I think that I would just say that their writing and life there's a separation there. No matter how happy I am with a story or a book or a publication, or I'm still me. I still have to like go do all the things that I have to do and face myself in the mirror. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like it doesn't, it's what you do. It doesn't sort of fix everything or like solve everything. And I think when I was younger, especially, you know, maybe when we first met, Kelly, and I was writing, I really thought it was like the solution to everything that was unsatisfying, or the solution to everything, basically.
If I can sell a book, everything will be great.
Yeah. And and it's still very important to me and brings me great satisfaction, and I'm drawn to it and it makes me happy. But there's all these other things, and it is its own thing.
It's part of your life. It's not your life.
Part of my life. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is that I once had after I published my first book, I sent something out, thought it was really good. I still think it was pretty good. And it got rejected by a couple places, a story. And I called up, I've told this story many times. I called up my friend, John McNally, who's a writer I really respect and somebody I look up to. And I said, John, I have to ask you a question. It's really embarrassing. And do you still get rejected? You know? And John just starts laughing and he's like, you know, yes, there's just one rejection after another. It's, you know, it's a nonstop assault on my my mental state. And you just have to keep driving on through it. And it's embarrassing to say, but I think that's something I also didn't really realize as a young writer, is that even the people you most admire, the writers you most admire, they are still getting rejected all the time.
Still hear no's. I remember, actually, speaking of Julie, one of the first things that she said to me when we were submitting my first novel, we submitted it to 20 places and we got 19 no's. And she kept saying, it only takes one yes. It only takes one yes. It only takes one yes. And there's that little hint of my Julie imitation coming through my voice. That is sort of what she talks like. It only takes one yes. But I cannot tell you how many times I've told myself that over the years. Like, it's only one yes. That's all we need.
I love that. That is the mark of a good agent.
She's amazing.
So we have
she's here.
All of a sudden we have a bunch of questions. So we're going to do a few rapid fire questions, Kelly.
Okay.
Did any cuts from The Unwilling make it into The Broken Tower?
No, because the story had moved on. All of those things took place in different times and places, but and there was nothing, the one thing that I was really sad about cutting was Ellie's perspective, and that mostly just got trimmed. Like I kept the stuff that I really needed from it. So yeah.
Excellent. Okay, Albert asks, the details in The Unwilling show how much you'll research for accuracy in the story. Do you recall what may have been the worst / grossest / hardest thing you Googled for either The Unwilling or Broken Tower? That's a great question.
That is a good question. I spent a long time trying to figure out if you could burn off a tattoo. And actually ended up writing to a cousin of mine who was very tatted up and was like, or I guess actually her husband. And I was like, so do you think you could burn off a tattoo? Could you show me like a scar from somewhere where you got hurt, where, you know, you had a tattoo? And he was just like, Jesus, don't talk about, don't do that. That's a bad idea. That's probably the grossest thing that I had to look up. Don't do it. It's a bad idea.
Okay, Janet asks, do you write an ending or does the plot develop organically? Do you write to an ending? Excuse me.
Right. I always say that I know A through like F, and then I know like W onward. And the stuff in the middle, I am sort of trying to figure out as I go along. I generally outline. I don't like do formal outlines, but I sort of plan 2 or 3 chapters ahead and with an eye toward where I ultimately want to be. So it seems to get me there so far. Hi, Janet.
Hi, Janet.
Okay, Jerry asks, in writing something of this scale, how many times when writing it have the characters thrown you something unexpected, or does that even happen?
Does it happen? That's sort of inching toward that whole writing is magic thing. I think, you know, there have been some things that I kind of wanted them to do that they haven't done. There were few things, particularly in The Broken Tower, I wanted Judah to get involved in this relationship. And when I got to that part in the book, I was like, oh no, this isn't what we want to have happen. And there's a climactic scene in The Unwilling that I sort of knew it had to happen, but I didn't really know until I was there. Like, are we doing this? Is this, can I do this? Can I get away with this? And I guess I did. I mean, it happens sometimes, but I think it's less about the characters throwing you curveballs than it is like things have to happen for the story or can't happen for the story because you haven't earned them. And if I had wanted to go back and rework the whole story to earn that relationship that I wanted to plug Judah into, I suppose I probably could have, but it would have been the wrong thing to do. If that makes sense.
Thanks, Jerry.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Phoebe asks, what stories are feeding your storytelling lately? Books or movies or TV? Are we going to get a Lost reaction novel from you?
No.
I would read it.
That would be sort of fun, but no. What am I? Well, I'm very behind the times. I'm actually watching The West Wing right now, which is a lot of fun, but sort of escapist. What have I read? Right now I'm reading Bell Hooks, which is really smart, but not really fantasy wise. What have I really loved? Naomi Novik's new series is fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that. And God, what else? I have the worst memory for books. Like I it's the one reason I still use Goodreads, because I have to like look and be like, did I read that? Did I like it? Was it good? What was it about? So that's sort of, I mean, I'm in a very different, I'm sort of working on this non-fantasy novel that has to do with an alcoholic actor. And so I've been listening to a lot of memoirs, addiction memoirs, which is really a party, let me tell you. But I did just listen to Carrie Fisher's Wishful Drinking, which I highly recommend because she reads it. She's wonderful. She reminds me of my mother-in-law. And right now I'm listening to Lit by Mary Carr, which is also pretty amazing. So I think that, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Phoebe, but that's as close as I can come.
It's a great list. Okay, I saved my favorite question. Oh, we have 2 questions. Oh, they're coming through. Okay, I think we can squeeze them in. What, in your opinion and experience, is the main strength of telling a story as a series as opposed to a standalone? More space.
More space, I guess, knowing that you can sort of go on. But I don't know. It's never really, like I said earlier, like I don't know that I really set out to write a series. And I've never, I think about somebody like Shannon McGuire, who has written like 800,000 series, like possibly literally, and also a handful of standalones. And she would be a great person to ask that question to, because I think that she probably has a really deep understanding of the differences between series and standalone novels. I've written 1 standalone and 2 connected, or I've written, 3 standalone novels and 2 that are connected. And I felt really bad about that cliffhanger. I guess that's actually not an insignificant answer. Is I felt like I should have tied it up, but that was where it ended. So yeah.
That's great. So I saved my favorite question for last.
Yes.
From Erin. It is for both of you. Have you ever considered writing a novel together? Is it harder to read each other's work in fear of upsetting the other with honest feedback?
We've written a short story together, but it was sort of it wasn't a traditional short story. So I don't know, like he wrote his sections and I wrote my sections.
It wasn't a true collaboration in that sense, was it?
No, it
Sort
wasn't.
of by design, we weren't like editing each other.
We cheated a little. But it's in a collection called Exo Orpheus, edited by Kate Bernheimer, if anybody's interested. But, we met in graduate school. We weren't in writing classes together, but we shared each other's writing very early. And I think that was one of the big reasons, is because I couldn't have dated somebody who was a bad writer. And I think he probably felt the same way. So I remember that sort of first trade of fiction, like, it was almost like, do you clean your toilet? Like, which way do you put the toilet paper in the bathroom? Because we could, do you snore? Do you chew with your mouth open? Like, this could be a deal breaker. And fortunately wasn't. So, our relationship sort of formed around us sharing each other's writing. And I think I get the better part of the deal because he is such a good editor. He's very smart and he's also very supportive. And he really, it's a tricky thing to do, to like give useful criticism while also not making the other person feel emotionally destroyed. And he's really good at sort of threading that needle and, getting the big things across, but also making me feel very warm and loved. Maybe he's different with people he's not married to.
It's very nice of you to say. I think that I could imagine us writing something together. We've talked about it before. I think it would just be it would have to be the right idea that both lit us up. I mean, it's hard. It would be a lot of you would have to spend a lot of extra time with me.
Is there extra time that I don't already spend with you?
I remember at the pandemic was we spent a lot of time together.
We do.
And I'm lucky to spend so much time with somebody that I love so much and enjoy so much. But I think that collaborating with the person that you live with would be an extra, especially on a book length project, right?
Yeah.
It would be a lot to take on.
I co-wrote the screenplay to Josie and Jack. And I think that, we did it when Sarah and I wrote that, never having even met each other. And I think that it was really useful to be able to sort of step away, to have that distance, and I know you collaborate a lot on things, but it's always with people that you talk to on the phone occasionally.
It's true. I can't
FaceTime with.
That's another thing too, is that I love collaborating and get a lot out of it, but it's actively hard for me to have somebody else in the room.
Yeah.
When I'm working, I don't know. I'm easily distracted, I think, that way.
Speaking of distractions, I keep seeing in the chat, somebody keeps asking, I said something about our brag shelf.
Yeah, Rob asked, my buddy Rob asked about it. And I just want to say, I like to think of it as the celebration shelf.
That's probably nicer. I never expected to be a writer, so I call it my brag shelf, but it is a communal brag shelf. It is where we have all of our collective publications and editions in various languages. And there's a separate brag shelf that has our friends' books on it.
Oh, I love that.
That we love. So
we do brag on them.
We do brag on them. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful vibe to leave with tonight as we go off into our evenings. Thank you both so much for this great discussion. Thank you to everybody who joined us online and folks who are watching this on YouTube afterward.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.
Oh, a pleasure. Fun. We love you guys. We're always so happy to have you in our lives as a bookstore and as human beings.
Next time we can do it in person.
Please. Yes, we will. We'll be back.
Thank you for having me, Susanna.
Go get these books, get Kelly's wonderful books from Oblong or your local independent bookstore. Thank you all so much.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye, everyone. Thank
night.
you.